Breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 9 minutes before 8. Well, let's come back to our conversation about these restrictions, having to go to a hotel or, of course, that possible jail term, and bring into the conversation Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, who joins me now. Secretary of State, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Do you agree with the potential length of sentence, 10 years? And if so, why?
Well, it's a fine of it's a sentence of up to 10 years. It's not a 10-year sentence.
Yeah.
The important thing is here, if you
do you agree?
deliberately
10 years, Secretary of State.
Up to 10 years.
Yeah, I know that, but that's up to the same of a firearms crime, sexual offence, or even, in some instances, rape. So you do agree?
Well, rape can have a sentence of life, as you know, but it's it is the case that if you were to deliberately mislead and you to bring a mutation of the virus in that, you know, for whatever reason couldn't be stopped by vaccines, and there's a lot of ifs, but the sentence isn't 10 years, it's up to 10 years, then you would be putting a lot of
Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, the former Supreme Court judge. Let's say, do you really think non-disclosure of a visit to Portugal is worse than firearms crime, sexual offences involving minors, for which the maximum is 7 years? It's the maximum, up to. So you agree that trip from Portugal is worse than Lord Sumption's words? Mr. Shapps.
So when you bring a variant, a mutation of coronavirus in, and run the risk of hundreds or thousands of people being ill or even dying, we think it's right to have the maximum tariff, not what people are likely to get, because people are unlikely, I think, given the size of tariff and the fines involved, to do this. But we do think there need to be very clear penalties in place, because what you do, your behaviour, and you say it's only travelling from a red list country, what's the harm in that? Well, the harm in that, as we've seen, is a lot of people die from coronavirus, and so it's important to protect the population, the wider population, and of course people shouldn't be travelling anyway, so this really shouldn't come into play.
So just to come back to you're not likely to get the 10-year term, is what you've just said.
Well, that's up to the courts. You know, when you set these tariffs, the court
decides. But why does it have to be so disproportionate?
Well, we want to send a very clear message and make it very straightforward. It is not acceptable. It's not sort of okay to forget that you travelled from a red list country. And I think in particular, people are thinking about situations where, well, I was in Brazil, but of course there are no direct flights. You have to have flown via
just
somewhere else.
To clarify,
I'll leave that off my form. It's those types of things where people are trying to deliberately mislead the authorities and put other people's lives at risk.
So there is no limit to the oppression which this government is happy to bring about?
Well, the only oppression, if you don't mind me saying, is us all having to, live for a year under some very strict and
oppressive,
it's fair to say, draconian rules.
Right.
And neither
so you're right.
Want to live under. And we want to be able to release people from all of this as quickly as possible. To do that, we do not want, just as we've managed to vaccinate 13.1 million people in total, we don't want to, by the way, more than all the rest of the EU combined, we don't want to trip at the last hurdle and then re-import a mutation that we're unable to deal with. Now, we know we have mutations all the time. We have mutations here, like the variants, like the Kent variant, but we don't want to make life even harder for ourselves. So this is to make life better overall. And yes, we're going to be making sure that the fines are pretty steep and the maximum potentially is very high in terms of sentencing. And I don't expect that people are going to break the law in this way, and I don't expect it will need to be used, but the fines and the law will be there if required.
Someone comes back from Portugal, from the Algarve, and their credit cards are maxed out, or they've done business meetings or whatever, and they haven't got £1,750 to stay in one of these hotels. What happens then?
Well, first of all, people have had ample opportunity to come back. Remember, quarantine exists for everyone. You will have already had to have had a pre-departure test for everyone. You must be filling in this passenger locator form. In fact, you can't get on a flight without doing those things nowadays. Yeah. So all of those things will have had to have happened. But from Monday, you will be required to quarantine. There isn't an exception to that rule.
I hear you. So someone who's listening to this now in Lisbon on business or whatever, and they don't have £1,750 on their credit card or in the bank, what happens to them? Presumably they go to jail, do they?
As ever, for British citizens abroad, they would want to contact the FCDO, the post. In the case of someone in Europe, that would be the one in Malaga. and seek help and advice.
No, they're landing at Gatwick or Heathrow. They haven't got. How presumably they get put in a bus.
That's not quite how it works, Nick. So
what
actually,
happens?
So what happens is you have to have on your passenger locator form indicated where you will be staying, including if you're coming from a red list country. It sort of forces the choice into ensuring that you have to be in a quarantine hotel. So as soon as you say, I have been in a red list country, Brazil, South Africa, South America, or Portugal, as you say, it then guides you to that, so you wouldn't end up arriving at Heathrow and suddenly discovering that's something which would have happened.
But still, you have to give your credit card at check-in, presumably, do you?
So you will have had to have paid for the package,
right.
And
so this is my point. If you haven't got £1,750, what happens then?
As I say, in extreme hardship cases, where people have not...
Why don't you just jail them? Surely your government would just want to put them in jail, wouldn't you, for not having 1,750 quid? That would be in keeping currently, wouldn't it? How about just 5 years? 5 years if you haven't got enough cash. How about that?
I see the line of question you're going now. Fortunately, we have a judiciary, we have legal processes to go through. It's not that the government bangs anybody in jail.
Okay.
Secondly, there is the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. They have posts all around the world. In the case of Europe, you'd be contacting them in Malaga.
And finally,
hold on, let me finish.
Sorry,
of course,
Mr.
the
Shapps,
situation to them.
Yep.
There are small amounts always of hardship funds and assistance made available, but I don't want to give the impression that you can call up and sort of provide some story. The answer is, I'm afraid, that actually that there are very shrinkingly few reasons now why people would be in a red list country not have already returned before next Monday.
It's quite a lot, though.
They've been red list countries for a while.
£175 a night, Mr. Shapps. In many parts of the country, that would be like a 5-star hotel. It's quite a lot. There was no opportunity to talk of a discount rate here or something.
No, but it's not just for the hotel stay. Obviously, it's food. Overall,
they get a Scotch egg as well, do they? I see. Okay, and so presumably.
Hold on. It's also there are a series of coronavirus tests. One on day 2 and one on day 8. You're paying for that. You're paying for the transportation. You're paying for the security, because of course guests aren't able to meet other guests. I'm afraid. I mean, your point is right in one sense. This is a very tough regime, but bear in mind, nobody should be going on holiday. No one should be leaving this country. No one should be travelling around the UK without specific reasons, and certainly not going abroad.
Sometimes people go to say farewell to dying relatives or attend funerals. Something else, of course, the government isn't currently permitting with a couple who've been married for 50 years and he couldn't say goodbye to his widow. But we'll move on from that. So you'll have to create a new law, will you? Or this is under an existing law?
So these are under so-called statutory instruments, which are under existing laws. It requires secondary legislation to put them. How
long will they be in place, Secretary of State?
So we will review this every month. And we'll make sure that it remains proportionate. And look, I understand all your questioning, but what we need to do, and I think all your listeners would expect, is ensure that as we've got to the point where we've vaccinated 13 million people, where we're seeing the case numbers come down, but where we see mutations taking place here and elsewhere, by the way, we don't want to get tripped up at the last stage here and end up importing something which we then don't have the facility to deal with until the vaccine is amended, presumably later in the year. We don't want to be in that situation, and your listeners would not expect us to allow it to happen at this stage either.
Briefly, because we're coming to the end of our time together, and I appreciate your time. You will recall that last year we spoke quite energetically at times about the use of the hard shoulder to be turned into what was called a smart motorway. I don't actually recognise that. I note that earlier this month you don't think smart motorways is a particularly good name. You described it as misnomer. What would you call them, and what safety measures are being taken, and how do you react to the fact that in some instances coroners are saying that there could be a significant risk of future deaths? Secretary of State.
So I want to see motorways which are safe and safer than the ones that came before them. And that's the absolute key. And the reason I'm critical about the way that they've been rolled out in the past is because they're supposed to have stop detection radar, which would enable lanes to be closed instantly. And it's been shown where you've got all the technology in place, these are safe and safer. The trouble is they were built without those stop detection cameras in place, and many other safety measures, 18
I appreciate
in total.
You don't build them. So how was that allowed to happen?
So I'm fixing that is the key point. And in fact, I brought the fix forward by several years and most recently to next year, which I announced last week at the Select Committee, as you mentioned.
So when will that be completed? When will they be safe?
In 2023, it should
In
just be
2023,
said. Sorry,
Secretary?
they were going to be 2023. I'm
I'm
bringing it
sorry.
forward to 2022. It should be said that when you look at all the data on smart motorways, it's not quite as straightforward as sometimes it's being represented.
Okay.
In other words, fewer people are actually dying on the so-called smart motorways. I'm not satisfied. I don't think they're good enough. I'm unhappy that the spaces between, for example, the rescue areas are being built too far apart. So we're addressing those things as well as making sure the technology is in place. Give a simple example. The red X that would come up and close off a lane before wasn't legally enforceable. We've just had a long discussion about what is and isn't legally enforceable. That wasn't. And that's wrong in my view.
So when will
because
this be
it means
right?
that, that people would abuse it. That we've already changed the law on that, for example.
Okay, and so when will this be corrected, Secretary of State?
Well, by next year, it's been corrected all the time. We've already gone and marked all of the emergency areas. I've had 10 new additional ones put in on the M25. I've got the smart detection technology, which wasn't going to come in until the second half of this decade, will now come in by next year. We've legislated so the red X gives you a fine, so people actually know not to do it and don't risk it, and about 15 other measures. So there's a long list of things.
So by next year,
to make sure it's progressive. It's getting safer and safer as a result of all.
So the M25, these stretches are now safe. Lastly.
Well, I think that they get better and better the more of these things you do. But there are more things I want to do yet. For example, I'll give you one example. It's crazy, but actually in the highway code, it doesn't actually describe what to do when you break down. And you've got different types of motorways, things called these motorways where lanes open and close variably. I mean, it's crazy. We can't have lots of different systems. We want a single system that works, and lots of education around it as well. I'll be launching a £5 million education campaign so people actually know what they're supposed to do in different situations. For example, did you know if you're in a lay-by, if you're in one of these emergency areas, you actually dial a number to close the lane off so that you can
I had no
exit
idea.
it. Most people wouldn't know that.
No,
I didn't know it until I started to study the subject.
Okay. So lastly, when these are done, Secretary of State, when these cameras, you'd be confident to take your car and effectively park in the hard shoulder with your family on board, would you?
Well, you'd never want to park in a hard shoulder. And by the way,
you have enough confidence
people
to take your family along the hard shoulder.
The thing I should point out is 1 in 10 fatalities take place at the moment on traditional conventional hard shoulders. They are not a safe place to be in themselves, and actually the rescue areas set back from the road with cameras on them, marked out properly, are actually much safer places to be.
If you can get to it.
If you get to it, that's right. So lots and lots of measures that we're taking, including, for example, making sure you can always see where the next safety area is by signage, GPS data, and the rest of it. So we're using a lot of technology in this as well, but they're getting progressively better and better. And I am critical of the way that over the years these things have been rolled out, and we're putting it right.
Grateful for your time. Thank you. Grant Shapps here on LBC, where it's 4 minutes after 8. Time for the news.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick is expected to announce billions of pounds of further funding to help tackle the cladding crisis. Hundreds of thousands of leaseholders face huge bills to make their homes safe. Our correspondent Rachel Venables has been following the story.
£1.6 billion has already been put up by the government to pull flammable cladding from some high-rises, but it's nowhere near enough. The real cost of this